The coach jolted over a frozen rut, and Anna Cole felt the letter in her hand tremble like a small, frightened bird. Outside, the maples along the road shuddered black against a bruised October sky. Inside, the paper was warm from her palm, smudged at the corner where Sarah's ink had gone soft with rain and distance. Anna had read the letter so many times, the words had the feel of something stitched into her bones. "Come," she had written, "there is work, there is a place." She had packed $40 into the corset her mother had taught her to mend, folded the money into a pouch of muslin, and sewn it into the seam. The city had 1,000 little sharp corners. The frontier promised blunt ends and maybe, if God was merciful, a new pattern to her life. The coach lurched. Outside, Granite Creek came into view like a painting someone had ruined with smoke. Low wooden stores, a single brick courthouse, a water trough where horses huddled. Men in coarse coats stood in doorways, watching the road as if all invitations from the world had to be judged before they might be accepted. She thought, absurdly, of how different it felt to carry a letter than to carry a trunk. Letters lived in the interior. Trunks were the loud, public sort of truth. The letter had been soft as a lover's hand. When she reached for it now, a second paper slid from the fold. A thin, official-looking thing, browned at the edges. "Taxes unpaid," the county clerk had written in a blunt hand. "Claim for Lot 42, surveyed, right to mine and grow, etc." There was a line at the bottom towards which Anna's eyes punched like a child finding a loose tooth. Unless paid within 30 days, the county reserved the right to reassign the claim. She had come because Sarah had said there was work and because Sarah had been her sister. She had expected a cabin smelling of boiled linseed and soap, the faint, permanent shuffle of someone else's steady hands. She had not expected the shuttered door, the single boot lying on the stoop, nor the smear of someone's last hurried mark across the lintel. There are different sorts of silence. The silence that greeted Anna at Sarah's cabin was like a hand laid flat across a mouth, still, a little damp, and full of accusation. They told her at the coroner's table that Sarah had taken fever fast. One neighbor, Mrs. Gable, spoke as if she were untangling yarn. "Took her in her sleep," she said. "Poor thing. No kin but you, isn't it?" Anna pressed the letter harder until it cut her palm. The house smelled like old flour and soot, and a woman who had learned to live on small victories, a mended sleeve, a jar of beans tucked away. On the table lay Sarah's ledger, pages of neat, hopeful notes, a tally of tools, a single entry circled with nervous ink, taxes due. Anna's fingers found that circle like a compass needle finding north. She had come because Sarah had said there was work, and because Sarah had been her sister. She had expected a cabin smelling of boiled linseed and soap, the faint, permanent shuffle of someone else's steady hands. She had not expected the shuttered door, the single boot lying on the stoop, nor the smear of someone's last hurried mark across the lintel. There are different sorts of silence. The silence that greeted Anna at Sarah's cabin was like a hand laid flat across a mouth, still, a little damp, and full of accusation. They told her at the coroner's table that Sarah had taken fever fast. One neighbor, Mrs. Gable, spoke as if she were untangling yarn. "Took her in her sleep," she said. "Poor thing. No kin but you, isn't it?" Anna pressed the letter harder until it cut her palm. The house smelled like old flour and soot, and a woman who had learned to live on small victories, a mended sleeve, a jar of beans tucked away. On the table lay Sarah's ledger, pages of neat, hopeful notes, a tally of tools, a single entry circled with nervous ink, taxes due. Anna's fingers found that circle like a compass needle finding north. At the county office, she found Harrow as any great thing hides itself in small things. A man who controlled not through loud threats, but through ledger entries and signatures. Mr. Harrow wore a hat like a carved roof and carried a look that made men stand straighter or bend more willingly. His name was on more deeds than the town had cobbles. When Anna asked about the tax, about the 30-day notice, his smile was the size of a closed fist. "Claims go by law," he said, meaning by his. "Mrs. Gable told me your sister's been ailing. Sad business. There are expenses that fall where they must." When she said she had saved, when she showed the thin pouch stitched into her seam, he took the coins, weighed them on the flat of his palm, and let her see how small those bright discs were. "$40 is nothing to chuck at a claim, Miss Cole. But you're from the city. We do things differently here." It was not his hands Anna remembered so much as what his hands did with paper: skimming, folding, stamping. He had an assistant at the counter, a clerk whose eyes slid from Harrow to Anna with the practiced silence of someone who kept lists of people like cattle. The name on Harrow's ledger was a neat inkblot, Sarah Cole. The line next to it read, in a hand that pretended to be impartial, "Unpaid fine, misdemeanor trespass, fine for breach to be satisfied by labor." Underneath, in letters that made Anna's stomach move, an amount: $3. The number should have been comical. $3 could not buy a ribbon, let alone a life. But on the paper it read like commandment. The clerk pointed to a thin wooden cell in the back lot where iron still bit into a ring. There sat Jonah Wilder. Jonah's name had a rumor that clung to it like riverweed. Wild man, burned by lightning of misfortune, an outlaw of sorts. At least that is how the town's lips shaped him. When Anna first saw him, he was a shape of shoulders and bone, sitting on a bench with the sun trying and failing to make him into anything softer. Rust ran down his forearms from the cuffs that had more history than the men who made them. His hair grew in a dark tangle, and his beard was the color of one-night fires. A brand was scarred on his forearm, a shallow H, or perhaps a wish of some man to mark property, old and pale against his skin. He watched her with the stillness of someone used to being watched. He did not move when the clerk pushed the paper across the slat. He did not watch Harrow. He watched Anna. "You don't have to do this," Jonah said, voice low and edged with a humor that had learned how to hide itself. Anna's hand, the hand that owned all her courage for the moment, lifted the muslin pouch and set it on the bench. The coins made a small, decisive sound. 3 metallic notes, thin and bright. People turned to listen because there was something theatrical about buying a person in a crooked room. Anna felt the town press itself around the small transaction like a body around a candle. One of the men near the doorway sneered softly. "You don't own what they say you own, mannish," he said to Jonah, or to the world. "You'll dance for your keep." Jonah's mouth tilted. "I'll do what I'm hired for," he said. "I ain't a dance." Anna signed the paper with the care of someone who had stitched a gown, her hand steady, her letters precise. On the line under the fine amount she wrote her name, and below that she wrote, "Guide and protector to the claim described in Sarah Cole's ledger," because she knew the language of deeds better now than she had an hour before. Her pen trembled only once. "You cannot lawfully own a man," the sheriff said from the doorway, voice like a worn coin. His uniform rustled like old paper. He had the look of a man who kept his balance by leaning on the law, and allowed the law to lean on him. He coughed and added a clause in his own hand about temporary servitude until the fine's labor had been satisfied, as if the law could be turned into a hinge to prop the town's door. "You won't find me a slave," Jonah said. His voice did not rise. "I'll be paid, woman. I'll be paid with what work I do." Anna set the 3 coins between his hands. They were small things, silver, shining like cold water. Yet in her chest something else shifted. A different economy took hold, one made of choice rather than pity. She had not bought him. She had offered him a handhold upon the cliff, and he had reached for it. Jonah's fingers closed around the coins with the same tenderness a man might give to feeding a hawk. He kept his eyes from her face. "You got a hard mouth for the road," he muttered, but there was no malice in it. It was a statement of fact. "Hard mouths are sometimes necessary," Anna said. She felt the words like a shield. When they left Granite Creek, the town had already put itself into neat ranks of opinion. Harrow watched from the porch of the general store, his hat like a small dark cloud. Mrs. Gable smiled at Anna as if the gesture could smooth every wrinkle in the day. The sheriff tipped his hat with a patience that smelled faintly of compromise. "People will talk," the town said. "People will guess." Anna had expected this. She had not expected the way the gossip would turn Jonah into a shape both monstrous and necessary at once. They rode out under an open sky that took its breath away. Anna sat behind Jonah on the narrow cart, her hand in the shelter of his coat at first out of fear, and then, surprisingly, out of something like comfort. He had the deep, slow warmth of someone who kept living things alive. His back was a map of small calluses and scars. The mountains ahead rose like old teeth. Wind made the small bells on her bonnet sing low. Jonah's hands were large and sure, as if they'd learned to command the elements. He checked the ox's harness with a mechanic's patience, then reached for the pack Anna had made of Sarah's blankets and a few jars. There were rules to traveling, where the world was rougher than a city's manners. Jonah began to teach them in small, plain ways almost at once. "Bank the fire when you go to sleep," he said, gathering pine boughs and talking as if the lesson were hunched in the wood itself. "Cover the coals with dirt and ash. They'll keep for a morning without getting you burned up like kindling. Don't make a smell. Keep meat hung high." Anna learned to fold a bed of moss as if she had always been a steward of the wild. She learned to read the weight of snow in a branch, the way a pine would complain before it broke. She learned the economy of water, how to hold it like a rare coin. Jonah's instruction was more like the closing of a hand around a necessary tool than a sermon. Practical, immediate, unmannered. One morning, crossing a small creek that had rushed in the spring but was now a thin vein of dark water, Anna's foot slipped on a stone slick with algae. The world tilted. Her boot filled with cold so fast it felt as if a second outside her own skin had opened. The current took the cart's wheel with a small, greedy hand. Anna caught at the nearest branch and felt the bone of it splay under her weight. For a breath, she tasted only river and cedar. For another, a small, primitive terror. Jonah was there, as if he had been waiting in the eddies himself. He lashed a rope to a sapling, wrapped it once around his waist, and waited. The water gulped at his thighs, then his chest. He moved like a thing that had been made by stone and water, deliberate, counterbalanced. He gripped Anna's arms, and his hands held her as if she were an offering he could not let fall. He hauled her clear with such force and steadiness that when she landed on the bank, the world seemed to click back into place around her. "You all right?" he asked, breathless but not panicked. The question was not small. It was the precise thing a person asks when they mean to be a cosigner on someone else's continuance. Anna stared at her hands, at the mud that had found refuge under her nails. Her breath stung like new frost. "I am," she said, because to say anything else would be to let the water have a second victory. On the bank, while Jonah worked on the cart's wheel with a practiced curse, Anna took off her bonnet and shook the water from her hair. He watched. There was no comment in his face. He had learned restraint through endurance. Later, as they made a meal of salted pork warmed over a tiny flame, Jonah reached for the ribbon that had once been Sarah's. Without asking, he moved close enough to braid. His fingers handled her hair as if it were thread of something very valuable. He wove 3 strands together with a careful speed. Anna closed her eyes, the action of the braid folding around her like a remembered shape. There was intimacy in the simple giving of hands to another's care. It felt like being mended without stitches. "You always braid like that?" "No," she asked at last, his voice small against the crack of the fire. "No," she said. "My mother taught me. She said a woman's hair can be her keeping." "You got her courage," he said. It was not overt praise so much as an observation of fact. A city girl who'll come out here with a letter and a pouch sewn away, that's not nothing. Anna's fingers fiddled at the edge of the bread he handed her. She wanted to tell him about Sarah, about the laundry lines she'd strung, about the way she had hummed under her breath while mending a collar. But grief is often a private economy too. It refuses to be spent in public before it has been counted. So Anna said instead, "I can mend shirts and sew on buttons. I can keep accounts if need be." Jonah cocked his head as if cataloging. "Good. Keep your hands busy. People who keep busy don't let doubt set like mold." At night, they made the shelter against a lee of rock. Jonah showed her how to bank the coals and how to tuck a small stone just so to prop the lid of the kettle to keep steam from stamping itself into the meat. He told stories that were brief and edged, about a sister who could whistle songs out of a house that had fallen, about wolves who learned to take only what they needed. He spoke a little of the place he had come from before the wild broke his life, names like the kind of maps you don't quite trust to paper. When he spoke of the fire that had taken his family, his voice slid into a quieter register, as if the words themselves were fragile. "I tell it like this," he said once, staring into the flames, "so it don't get to be some lantern that lights every room I walk into. Fire wants to get up and travel. I keep mine small." Anna nodded. She had kept small fires of her own since Sarah's death. The ironing board set up by an open window, the careful rationing of soap. She found herself listening to Jonah as if to a weather forecast. He told the future in the way the wind folded, in the color of cloud. There were moments, tiny ones, that surprised her. He had a kindness for the small and base, for bandaging a blister with a scrap of linen, for cutting plasters from an old shirt, for wrapping a jar of her father's tobacco in oilcloth when they left a town too rough for the smell of it. He was not given to unnecessary speech, but when he did speak, it was precise and often corrective of rumor. "People who frighten others like to make themselves into stories," he told her, one evening as they mended a torn wagon cover. "Stories don't have to be true to be big, but they're still easy to unpick." Anna found herself unfolding her own stories like a spool. She told him how she'd left Philadelphia not because it had bitten her, but because it had quieted her, made her small in the way of shops that close on gentle nights. She spoke of Sarah's handwriting, left-handed, looped, which they had found in a margin of the ledger as if Sarah had kept writing little affection notes to a future that never arrived. Jonah listened, his hands busy but patient. Once, when she reached the part about Sarah's last days and the fever, he took off his hat and stood in the black night like a sentinel. "You'll be easy prey in town," he said finally. "Harrow looks for people who move in small numbers. He finds a hole and pushes paper through it." Anna understood that accusation. It meant that the fight ahead might not be a single moment of violence, but a slow stacking of small formalities, signatures, fines, threats stitched into the fine print. She had looked at Harrow's ledger and felt the weight of someone else's pen making decisions about people's skins. That was a kind of theft, too. They found the claim 2 days from Granite Creek, a thin shelf of land where Sarah had planted a few stubborn rows of potatoes and set a post with her name nailed to it. The post had been there a while. The wood had drunk in weather. Someone had carved a shallow H into the post, perhaps in jest, perhaps with meaning. Anna's stomach folded when she saw it. Harrow's mark, the same as the brand on Jonah's forearm, pressed into the world like a small, cruel signature. "Signs can lie," Jonah said, and yet he did not reach to touch it. He only looked at her with a sort of fierce, respectful attention that made her feel both seen and necessary. They set up the cabin with Sarah's planks and the tarps Jonah carried. The first night in the shell of Sarah's house, they lit a fire and sat with its light thrown across their faces like a promise of ordinance.
Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote called once and then fell quiet, and the dark made the porch rail into the shape of a hand waiting. Anna kept busy. She counted leavings and receipts, inventoried jars and plow parts, and tried to organize the paperwork in the ledger into a manner that might stand closer scrutiny. Outside, Jonah scouted the perimeter, set snares, and showed her where to hang meat away from foxes. Their work was not romantic. It was the daily arithmetic of survival. Mend a hole in the shirt before it becomes a rag, keep the window battened before a storm comes, keep the pot from running dry. At dusk of the third day, Jonah sat across from her on the split-rail bench and took out a knife. He ran it along the edge of a stick until the wood curled like ribbon. He handed the curl to Anna and waited until she touched it. It felt like a small, private ritual. "You keep the ledger safe," he said. There was not much to his voice beyond the careful measure. "You keep what is yours. Don't let a man tell you otherwise." "How do you know what's mine?" she asked. The question was not from naivete so much as hunger for direction. "Because you came," he said. "That says something. Most women who come out this way don't come alone.
They come because they're running. You came because you were going somewhere." She looked at him as if measuring him for truth. He did not flinch. "I came for Sarah," she said, "and for what she kept, for what I can make of it." He nodded then, a small movement that seemed to carry an entire weather report. Outside, the sky tightened as clouds stacked up. The scent of coming rain moved through the cabin like an animal. Jonah rose and braided Anna's hair again, this time faster, with the confident fingers of a man who threads rope and hair the same way. When the wind came, it came hard, taking the smell of wood smoke and making it a churn in the rafters. They battened the shutters, bankers of coal in their hands, and listened to the roof hold the rain. Anna could hear the town as a thin rumor, but it felt far. Here in the dripping dark, Jonah's presence was not rumor but fact. A man who could make a kettle sing through the night and keep the coyotes from learning the sound of small things. He did not tell her the whole of his story that night. He offered fragments, like stones in a stream. A house that had once been full, a child who learned to throw stones, the acrid taste of smoke. He said the name of the place once, then folded it away, like a map he did not wish to share. In the dark, they spoke less in words than in small exchanges. A loaf split between them, a hand passing a cup, the steadying pressure of a shoulder when the roof shuddered. Before sleep took them, Jonah placed his palm over Anna's hand as if making an agreement. It was not possessive. It was a pact of protection. "No one will be able to say you didn't try," he said, voice rough as the roughest bark. "And I'll not be the one to let you down." Anna considered how much trust that statement asked for. She saw in his eyes the hard work that held a man together when the rest of the world offered him chains or chance. She had paid $3 for a guide, but she had gained something that counted for far more: a steady, deliberate ally. They slept with their backs toward each other, neither snoring. The night kept its own counsel, and at some point the rain lessened, the roof sighed, and the cabin settled into an exhausted hush. Dawn would bring a new set of tasks: a scoured path to the nearest spring, the need to mend a tarpaulin torn by some night's claw. Dawn would also bring the fact that they were no longer alone in the world that Anna had entered with a letter in her hand. The town had watched them leave. It had already set itself to whisper. When Anna woke, she found Jonah listening at the window, a shape of patient muscle and thought. He turned and saw her awake, and smiled in a manner that was more private than public. "You'll not be the sort to flinch when the town looks at you," he said. "You're steadier than you let yourself be." She took a breath and felt the new cabin air press on her ribs like a new dress. There was work to be done, and a ledger to be kept, and a town that would not be persuaded easily. Yet there was also the small, stubborn knowledge that she had not been abandoned by her own courage. Jonah had sailed them this far. But the current ahead was unknown, and the sound of a man's horse could be something like a gull call in the distance, close enough to make you look up and wonder whether the wind had turned for the better or for the worst. There were bad winds that spring, and worse news that followed them. Word reached the ridge in small, precise ways. A man's laugh too loud at the tavern. A milk pail left on a stoop with its contents tipped out. A handbill nailed in a careless hand to the telegraph post inviting claim jumpers to take what they pleased. Anna read these as a ledger reads a balance, each mark a subtraction from the account of safety she'd been trying to build. Harrow's shadow did not approach in a single dramatic stride. He shifted the weight of paper and people instead. He began to send men up the trail at odd hours. His men said they were looking for stray cattle or inspecting snares, and left with a crooked grin. Once, a man in a coarse coat, Harrow's bootlicker, Caleb, arrived at the cabin and spoke to Anna as if reading from a list. "Nice work you've done here, miss. Shame about the claim. Law is a hungry thing." He watched Jonah as if the man were a loose bridle. Jonah watched him back with a careful, slow heat in his eyes. Anna did not flinch. She sharpened needles and kept the ledger in a small chest underneath where she slept, wrapped in oilcloth. She made a point of going to town to purchase a length of iron for a new window latch, of speaking plainly to Mrs. Gable at the post office, of handing a hunk of salted pork to a neighbor with a steady countenance. Each of these was, in her mind, a defense as much as a duty. Harrow's campaign was both public and sly. He filed new charges, petty trespass claims, accusations that Jonah had been seen on another man's land, sly scratches meant to bleed them dry of time and patience. On a late afternoon when the sun had gone thin and the air smelled of rain on stone, Anna came down from the ridge with a parcel of washed linen and a mind full of errands. She found two men waiting by the corral, one of them with the sheriff leaning against the trough like a man who had accepted a long sentence of compromise. The sheriff's face was smooth with routine, his hands empty of heat. "You're wanted," he said. And when words hung like that, they can mean anything from invitation to indictment. "Harrow wants a look at the ledger." Anna's stomach hollowed, but her voice stayed square. "The ledger's mine." "We'll need to verify the entries," the sheriff said. "Judge Vance will want to see you in court next week." She met Jonah's eyes over the sheriff's shoulder. He folded his shoulders in a way that told her he would go where she went, and that he would do so with the same hard, patient tolerance he used on the ridge. Inside the courthouse, the plaster smelled of old sweat and tobacco. Harrow sat as if he had been carved into the chair. His smile could be a thing you sharpened a blade on. He had a lawyer, a lean man with a tongue that liked the sound of contracts. He spoke in the measured cadences of people who make money out of other men's slowness. He claimed the ledger's entry for Lot 42 was irregular. He claimed Sarah's signature might have been improperly executed, and he claimed Jonah had been seen conducting himself in ways unbecoming a man in steady employ. Anna watched Harrow lay out the allegations with a kind of polite cruelty. A well-placed question here, a cough there, and the town's courtroom, always interested in good story, bent towards spectacle. The judge, Vance, had the patient face of a man who had seen more people than sense cross his bench. He listened with one hand under his chin. The law in Granite Creek was not the law of textbooks, but a thing stitched together by habit and by the weight of the most confident pen. Abernathy, the county clerk, with a careful, owl-like face, sat near the judge. Anna had seen him before. He organized ink and paper the way Jonah organized snares. He was quiet, the sort of man who read the town into the order of names on a ledger. When Harrow's lawyer called for Jonah to be declared a trespasser and for Sarah's claim to be reassigned, the courtroom took the phrase and chewed it like a coarse biscuit. Some faces were eager. Others watched with an expression that was neither cruelty nor pity, but the simple human calculation of whose side of the fence would be warmer. Anna stood when asked to speak.
She did not plead with theatrical voice or fall into the appealing tones of those seeking mercy. She explained plainly. The ledger, the dates, Sarah's handwriting. Her voice was the sound of someone who had sewn seams all her life, tight, true, without ornament. She produced the little muslin envelope with its receipts and the 3 coins still worming silver in her palm. She laid them on the council's table as if they were evidence and not the whole strange economy of what had bought Jonah's labor. Harrow's lawyer presented a paper that claimed to be an earlier deed, one that would place the claim under Harrow's control should Sarah's taxes remain unpaid. The paper bore a signature, a looping hand that looked like Harrow's, the sort of hand you expect from a man used to signing other men away. For a breath, the room thrummed with the sound of a verdict already made in copper coin. Abernathy rose then. The clerk had the look of a man who has examined too many hands and therefore learns the small betrayals of ink.
He explained, slowly and with a certain shy authority, that the ledger he kept had a practice. Every transfer was logged in a particular way and initialed. Dates were added in a manner that betrayed a particular clerk's habit. He had watched paper longer than gossip, and he had a mind for how ink dried. He pointed to a blot, a date that had no logical sequence, a note in the margin made in a recent hand. This entry was altered, he said plainly. The paper was taken out of my book, a separate note placed in, and the signature appears to have been copied. At that, the room shifted. Harrow's face hardened. Men muttered. The judge frowned. Abernathy asked for a look at the original ledger, and when he saw how the book had been handled, pages crossed and an entry smudged, he said that it bore the signs of tampering. He produced, with a care that felt almost ceremonial, the original page where Sarah had recorded payments in her looped, left-handed script. The ink was an honest brown. The dates matched. The circle that Anna had found was there, unaltered, and another nearby jotted note, Sarah's shorthand for a payment, had a different pressure to it than the forged entry. "You have forged this?" Harrow snapped, red flushing his cheeks. "I have no use for forges," Abernathy said. "I keep the town's memory. Someone has replaced my page and tried to force in their own. The book tells the truth if you know how to read it." It was a small counterpoint, a clerk's quiet work against a magnate's broad signature. But in towns like Granite Creek, paper mattered. People who read paper correctly could turn the currents of gossip back into a manageable stream. With Abernathy's testimony in hand, Judge Vance declared a short recess to consider the evidence and ordered Harrow to produce any other records authorizing his claims. Outside the courthouse, Harrow's response was not in quiet words, but in the kind of action that smells like a threat. That night, the ridge burned. They had been asleep when the first heat came. Jonah woke to the smell of wood giving way, and the sound that makes fear in the marrow, a small, bright, bird-like scream of flame. He threw open the door, and a pillar of orange painted the porch in impossible light. The cabin took the fire as if it had been waiting. The dry planks, the tarpaulins, Sarah's curtains, things that had kept them warm that morning, rose quick, furious. Jonah's hands moved in a way that had been practiced on wild nights. He pulled Anna and the chest with the ledger into the yard and scrambled for water. The oxen stamped and bawled. Men's voices came as a distant thing. Flames leapt and caught the roof beam. Sparks rolled out over the sage like a small constellation. The air tasted like iron. They fought the fire with blankets, with dirt, with water from a cracked barrel. But flames find oxygen the way rumor finds a tongue. When it was over, there was nothing much left to be burned into smoke. The cabin was a hulk, walls caved, the hearth a smear. The ledger chest had been dragged and found with its lid warped, pages blackened at the edges. Anna clutched the muslin wrapping and opened the book with hands that shook so much the writing blurred. Much was lost. A dozen small things remained. A butter dish with its lid half filled with soot. Sarah's ribbon snagged on a beam. A single jar unbroken by heat. The night after the burn, they made a lean-to of tarps and covered themselves with wet blankets. Anna woke in the black to a different sort of pain that pinched and gathered like lower weather. She pressed a hand to herself and felt the awful clean as a bell. She had known of the possibility. Frontier women knew what work and worry could do. But knowledge is not the same thing as the thing itself. The world shifted. She did not cry out. Instead, she turned to Jonah with the small, broken look of a ledger whose pages will never again be whole in the same way. He was careful, as if handling a live bird. He brought a cloth and warm water, and held her chin, and wiped with the gentle patience he used for braiding hair. He had been a man who used his hands to hold what was falling into ash. Now his hands were vessels for quiet things. He did not speak much that night. His silence was not absence, but a manner of concentration that made Anna feel both very seen and very alone. They moved to the trapping cave, an old miner's cleft Jonah knew of and had used as a place to lie low in harsh weather. It smelled of damp and mineral, and the kind of privacy the world cannot easily find. There, in the dark months that followed the burn, they lived and grieved in the small economies they had always known, mending socks by the light of a tallow lamp, sharing a single bowl of soup, standing guard at the cave's mouth while the wind tried to trade their bones for its song. The miscarriage took a portion of them away that did not return. It was not an event with blood and dramatic cries. It was the quiet giving away of something inside Anna's body and the fierce, restrained mourning that followed. She wrapped her grief around her like one more layer of clothing against the cold. Jonah stayed awake nights, keeping a hush over her, as if a loud world might steal the edges of the sorrow. When she woke, he would braid her hair, more tightly now, so the movement itself felt like a litany. Braiding had become a ritual that knitted them invisibly together. In the way his fingers interlaced hair, in the small knot he made at the end, there was a meaning that the town's words could not touch. Jonah's temper sharpened, not into uncontrolled violence, his arc did not lead there, but into a near razor that frightened the men who had once taunted him. He paced the mouth of the cave at odd hours, tongue working in answer to the world. Once he came back from Granite Creek with a split lip and his knuckles bruised from a skirmish with one of Harrow's men. He had not returned there to start trouble, or at least that is what he said. "You don't make a fight unless you have to," he told Anna, voice low. "But sometimes a man has to hold a man's ear so he learns not to bite." Anna resisted letting the cave become a prison of silence. She insisted they go to town when there was business that could be done. She carried the ledger browned and patched in an oilcloth, and she went to see Abernathy to plead for the clerk's testimony. They stood together in the small, packed room of the clerk's office. Abernathy sat behind a desk like an altar to ink. He studied the ledger with the trained, slow patience he was known for. "There's a pattern to when entries are made and by whom," Abernathy said. "People can copy a signature that looks right from a distance, but ink tells a truth the eye doesn't see at a glance. The pressure is wrong on Harrow's paper. Someone has taken a page from my book and tried to set it in. Give me time and I can show where the book was forced." His help was a quiet, vital thing. He would, as the clerk, testify that the page Harrow proffered had never been logged in the way such transfers were logged. He would say, in his soft way, that he had seen Harrow paw through other books for a year and had always noted a carelessness in the man's hands. It was small testimony, small as the twist of a needle, but in Granite Creek, small things could deflect a gale. When the day to descend on the courthouse came, the town had arranged itself into its usual weather. Some came because they were curious, some because they liked the spectacle of a powerful man brought low. Mrs. Gable showed up with a basket of rolls, Caleb came with a collar lifted, and a surprising number of men who had once turned their faces away stepped forward with memories of things Jonah had done. An axe lent in a storm, a horse led back from the drift, a bandage offered without question.
Testimony in Granite Creek often sounded like neighborly remembering, small favors, modest kindnesses. Those kinds of records mattered. The courtroom that day felt like a basin for held water. Every voice was another stone tossed in. Harrow's lawyer leaned heavy on formal accusations and on the forged paper. He had the audacity to produce, in addition, an affidavit from a man who claimed he had seen Jonah on another man's property, though that man's name was unfamiliar to many in the audience. The judge listened, and at times his pen made a tired sound on paper. Jonah sat on the bench with his hands folded and a face that was not seeking pity. He had a way of being present that made the room calm like a wind stilled by mountain. Abernathy was called. He walked forward with sleeves rolled and a small smudge of ink on one thumb like a badge of honesty. He explained the ledger's regularities and showed, with a patience that was plain and unshowy, how the page Harrow used was a bad fit. He compared ink, paper, and pressure.
He brought evidence of Harrow's habit of taking documents from his own chest of papers and propounding them as original to the court. "You have to trust the book if you want to trust the town," Abernathy said simply. "And if pages get moved around, the book tells it. Some marks, sir, don't lie." There were gasps and low murmurs when Abernathy turned Harrow's page and pointed to the corner where a careless hand had tried to hide the date. It was a small tornness, an erasure behind a fold, but in the whole pattern it looked like the seam of a garment hastily restitched. Harrow's face had the slow color of a man who had enjoyed being unseen. Now he found himself exposed. The judge frowned, as if at an unpleasant bloom, and asked for silence. Evidence, he said, had weight. The law in Granite Creek was not a blade, but a balance. Harrow could not be found guilty of arson on such testimony. The sheriff had not produced a confessional, and there was no smoke on the man, but the court could declare the forged deed invalid and order that Sarah's claim be restored. It could also, by local custom, impose fines and criminalize unseemly manipulation of public records. Harrow left the courtroom that day with the smell of scandal following him like a small cloud. There was no dramatic jail time for Harrow. Instead, there was a slow unraveling. Men who had sat at his table moved their chairs back. Contracts he had quietly encouraged were rescinded. For a while, the town watched to see if the magnate would vanish or retaliate in a manner that would shift the scales once more. Jonah's name was cleared in the ledger. Anna's standing was restored with a small formal note from the judge stating that the claim be recognized and that Harrow's paper be stricken from the record. When they left the courthouse, relief did not feel like joy so much as a kind of tired, brittle thing, like a plaid shawl unpacked after travel. People nodded at Anna. Caleb avoided her eye. Mrs. Gable offered her a pastry with a look that tried to stitch warmth where there had been ash. Jonah walked beside her with that slow, weathered gait that meant he was holding his breath against old instincts. He kept his distance the way a man who has been a target keeps from being the arrow. They had won in law, but the cost was counted outside of it. Harrow's men had already made an effort to frighten them back to the ridge, and in the burn and the miscarriage, they had stripped away part of the fragile sense of a future. Jonah's eyes held a wariness that the courtroom could not clean. He moved through the days with a suppression that was nearly prayer. That night, in the tent they had set beside the remains of the cabin, Jonah woke before the stars had cooled. He rose, hands clenching, shoulders working with the movement that made a man into something ready to be either protector or destroyer. They had won in law, but the cost was counted outside of it. Harrow's men had already made an effort to frighten them back to the ridge, and in the burn and the miscarriage, they had stripped away part of the fragile sense of a future. Jonah's eyes held a wariness that the courtroom could not clean. He moved through the days with a suppression that was nearly prayer. That night, in the tent they had set beside the remains of the cabin, Jonah woke before the stars had cooled. He rose, hands clenching, shoulders working with the movement that made a man into something ready to be either protector or destroyer. They had won in law,
but the cost was counted outside of it. Harrow's men had already made an effort to frighten them back to the ridge, and, in the burn and the miscarriage, they had stripped away part of the fragile sense of a future. Jonah's eyes held a wariness that the courtroom could not clean. He moved through the days with a suppression that was nearly prayer. That night, in the tent they had set beside the remains of the cabin, Jonah woke before the stars had cooled. He rose, hands clenching, shoulders working with the movement that made a man into something ready to be either protector or destroyer.
In his chest, a decision came like a bad weather front. He could stay and be exposed to Harrow's malice, or he could leave and take the danger elsewhere. His first instinct, the old one that had once been his only language, was to leave. He had long thought himself a bad gift to those who trusted him. To protect Anna, perhaps he must remove himself like a stone from a horse's path. He walked to the ridge's edge with his coat wrapped tight. The stars were hard as coins. He thought of the $3, the exchange that had begun it all. He thought of the brand on his arm, pale and private, and wondered if men like him were always doomed to be marks and warnings. He thought of how towns like Granite Creek liked a villain to point at, and he thought, bitterly, of the ways his presence could be turned into the wrong sort of story. The decision to leave felt like a scar forming. Anna found him there, not by sound, but by a small, inexorable knowing. She stepped out of the tent with the lantern, and her face was bone and candle. She did not plead. She did not say, "Please don't go." She said instead, "You think leaving will keep me from harm?" Jonah turned. For a long moment, he looked as though he might attempt another plan of departure, but the look on Anna's face held him. She had not come to tie him down. She had come because she would not let him make the choice alone. "I won't ask you to suffer for me," she said quietly. He said nothing, the wind taking his words away. "You think the world will be kinder without you?" she continued, "because then it will have only me to blame. But this," she gestured to the burned land and the tarped tent and the place where their life had tried to be, "this was a thing we built together. You don't get to walk away from what you made with me." Jonah's hands were in his pockets, fingers curling on something that may or may not have been a coin. "I'll only make you a target," he said. "You already were," she answered. "You tried to save me from water. You braided my hair in the dark. You walked back to town to fight with Harrow. You have not been my burden. You have been my choice." There was a pause, like a caught breath. Jonah's eyes, so often guarded, softened. There was something like a surrender there, but not of defeat. He seated himself on the ridge with a slow, human movement, and they watched the valley roll out beneath them. For a time, they sat without words, watching the town light itself like a small constellation being arranged. When they returned to the town the next morning, they were no longer just the victims of some cruel story. They bore a little of the authority that comes from having refused to turn away. Jonah walked in plain clothes rather than the rough coat of his old life, and people turned their faces with curiosity. Some older men nodded with a new, rueful respect. Younger ones kept their eyes cautious. The ledger had become a talisman, and Anna carried it with a quiet surety.
Harrow, for his part, attempted one last bit of theatricality. He stood in the street with a small audience and called Jonah thief and vagrant and worse. He tried to goad the man into a scene that would have made for a better story, something the town might savor. Jonah did not answer in kind. He looked instead at Anna and then at the crowd, and he said in a voice that he had honed until it was both raw and true, "I did what I was paid for, and I did more for free than the law would confess." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Old things, habits die with time and witness. Men who had once muttered little cruel sayings felt small. Mrs. Gable stepped forward and told the town how Jonah had once carried her husband's tools in a storm. Caleb, who had once looked like Harrow's shadow, said nothing. His silence was a kind of confession of timidity. In the thick of these minutes, Harrow's temper was not a legal thing, but a private one.
He slipped his fingers into another man's pocket, an affront, and Jonah's old line snapped. He reached for Harrow's cuff in a motion that tasted dangerously like the old preternatural violence the town had always blamed him for. For a breath, everyone feared the storm might break into something terrible. Anna stepped between them with the same plain force she had used in court. She took Jonah's hand in both of hers and squeezed it, firm, not entreating. "You will not be what they say," she said, not to Jonah but to the small crowd. "This is my claim. This is my sister's ledger. Let the law do its work." That day, the law, bolstered by Abernathy's testimony and witness statements of Jonah's deeds, leaned towards justice. Harrow could not be charged with arson, proof did not exist to convict him. But his forged document was a null. The judge ordered that certain fines be levied against him for tampering with public records, and the town demanded public restitution. An acknowledgement that the claim belonged to Sarah Cole, that Anna's stewardship was lawful, and that Harrow should cease and desist his interventions. Harrow paid the fines with a face like a man being watched while he undressed. He was not thrown into jail and he kept his estates, but the town's deference to him broke in small ways. Contracts he once controlled were rescinded. A few men who had once bought cattle from him refused to speak. He found himself increasingly alone in the storehouses where he had once been a king. The brand on Jonah's arm, the shallow H, lost some of its cruel meaning when the people who had whispered about him saw what he had quietly done for them when no one watched. The public victory did not erase the private furies. Jonah's temper, kept in check by choice, was a dangerous thing. When Harrow's men tried to strike at him with words or shoves, Jonah's restraint was a learned art. Once, in the alley behind the tavern, a thin man called him a devil to his face. Jonah's fist moved like lightning.
He had the man by the collar, and the room clouded with the sense of an old habit rising. He stopped, however, by remembering Anna's hand on his tether. He let the man go and walked away with a small cutting knowledge that while the law might be on their side, the town's memory moves on its own rhythms. After the trial, there came a night in which the victory felt large enough to stand under. Helen, who ran the inn, offered them a room, and, for once, they accepted help. The inn's bed smelled like flour and a kind of civility. They ate a slow bowl of stew and spoke about the future in a language that tasted both like promise and like practical work lists. Where would they plant? Who would help them turn the burned soil? How long would it take to get a proper roof? These were not romantic questions, they were honest and necessary. That night, after provisions were settled, after the judge's paper had been tucked into Abernathy's bag, and the town had turned homeward, dusted with small thanks, Jonah took them both away from the inn to a small stream that ran cold with melted snow. It was not the river where Anna had once fallen, but it had the same quick shimmer. He took with him an iron basin and a cloth he had saved from the burned cabin, a piece of Sarah's apron that had not been consumed. Anna watched him as he went about his task with the same concentrated tenderness he always showed with instruments. He filled the basin with water warmed over a small flame until it was the temperature of a hand held to a cheek. He cut the cloth into smaller squares and knelt as if to tie a shoe. Nothing about his movement was performative. He did not speak. The world hushes sometimes, like a room that has been cleared of its furniture. The two of them sat inside that hush. "Sit," he said simply. Her first thought was to make a wry comment, to decline, because such gestures between them had become private, and she feared exposing them to a public note. But the day had altered something in both of them, so that such gestures had become the language of truth. She sat. His fingers cradled her feet, rough as the bark of spruce, but careful as if he were holding paper. He unbuttoned her boots and slipped them off, as if he were reading the map of a place he loved. He ran the warm water across her skin, not with the glancing motion of a lover's hand, but with a measured, reverent economy. The act filled the small space between them with meaning.
Jonah washed away soot and ash and the little dusts that survive even after the law has done its work. He dried her with the softened cloth, and his motions were sure and deliberate. He did not speak, but in the quiet, 1,000 small words were present: forgiveness, apology, a pledge not to let her stand alone, and the mutual recognition that neither could unmake the recent past. She could have stood up and said this was foolish, that dignity did not require such service. Instead, she let him kneel.
To accept such care was, in their small economy, an act of allegiance. It was not humiliation, it was a practice of trust. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and looked at her with an openness that was almost boyish. They breathed in and out as if in the rhythm of a shared seam. "You didn't have to do that," she said at last. "No," he answered, "but I wanted to. You could take it as payment for $3, or you could take it as a way I know how to hold you." She let a small laugh escape. It was both weary and grateful. "I'll take it as your choice," she said, "not as my buying you." Jonah nodded, relieved in a way that made his shoulders fall. The title of the town's rumor, that he had been bought, had been a cruel shorthand that turned him into an object. This act, instead, reversed the economy. It was neither transaction nor pure romantic flourish. It was the careful, human ritual of two people tending one another. It answered the title in the only way it could, with humility and a kind of sacred silence. After that night, Jonah slept better. He did not leave immediately as he had once threatened. Yet the old urge towards self-exile did not wholly dissolve. He thought long about what it meant to be with someone who had chosen him freely rather than from pity or a bargain. He thought of Anna standing in court, of her hand that signed and kept accounts, of the ways she had not been cowed by fires or by the town. He saw, with the blunt clarity of the mountains, that he might drive danger upon her simply by being present. He wrestled with it in the private hours. One morning he walked away from the camp with nothing more than a light pack and a look that told Anna he might be gone for a while. He had the old man's refrain, "I can't be anything but trouble," and he wanted to remove that weight from her shoulders if she would let him. He left a note folded into Sarah's ledger, a few lines of poor handwriting that said he would be back when he could be less a lightning rod and more a steady man. That if she wanted him, she would find him. That he had loved her with what small weapons he had. Anna found the note before the sun had climbed entirely. She stood on the burned porch, wind old on her face, and read his words. For a moment, she considered doing what some women might have done in her place, and waiting, and letting a man make his own penance. Then, with the stubbornness that had been her companion since Philadelphia, she packed a small bag, an extra dress, the ledger, a spool of thread, and a handful of coins, and left for the path she knew Jonah had always taken to his secret traps. She found him in the trapping cave, where he had meant to lie in quiet and vanish into the country, perhaps forever. He was mending a net with a sort of ritual patience. When he saw her, he stood, and for a moment the two of them simply measured the space between choices. "You can't choose alone," Anna said. Her voice was not a demand, but a fact. Jonah's jaw moved. He looked at the net in his hands, and then at her. "I thought I might spare you." "You spared me nothing by leaving," she answered. "You only made the choice for me. We don't do that." He swallowed, and the corner of his mouth created the smallest of smiles, something like a chisel taking off a rough bit of stone. "You're right," he said. He folded the net and set it aside. "I'm tired of making choices by myself." They made a decision then, not of romance, but of work. They would build somewhere beyond the burned claim, in a valley Jonah knew on the far side of a ridge. Proper soil, a spring that kept almost by miracle, a spot with a south-facing slope for gardens. It was not a grand gesture, it was a practical plan. They would gather planks from the town's lumber yard, trade a portion of Jonah's furs for shingles and a new window, and ask a few neighbors for the loan of an ox for a day. These were the acts that would stitch a life into being, hauling beams, digging post holes, setting stones for a hearth.
When they left Granite Creek, the town's chorus gave them a small valediction. Mrs. Gable pressed a jar of jam into Anna's hands with a flourish that meant, "I forgive you for making us see the truth." Caleb offered his boys help to fetch lumber. Abernathy winked with a clerk's sly loyalty and handed them a scrap of paper with notes on where to find affordable nails. The gestures were small and human, and they carried more weight than any dramatic triumph. The valley they chose was a gentle hollow with a creek that sang modest songs, and a stand of birch for windbreak. They built the simple bones of a house with hands and borrowed axe. The first wall went up at noon, and by the next week they had a roof that did not leak and a hearth that would hold more than a small resigned fire. Their neighbors came, some with gruff humor, some with a more guarded curiosity, and the work became a conversation between them and the land. Days became a ledger of small tasks and kinder records. They planted potatoes and corn in Sarah's memory, laid out a new box of herbs Anna insisted upon, and set a line where clothes could flap and spin like a small usual prayer. Jonah repaired an old plow and taught a neighbor how to fell a sapling without cracking its heartwood. Anna mended shirts and made her hands quick with needle and thread. They braided hair in the evening while the stove hummed, a ritual that persisted like a small benediction of string. Their neighbors, Mrs. Gable, now a friend rather than a witness, Caleb with a less harried face, and a few men who had once been Harrow's customers, shared bread and news. They did not become a community of sudden saints. Prejudice and suspicion lingered like mud. But there was a small thrift of respect that had not been there before. People would ask for Jonah's help without the preface of injury. They would ask Anna to keep their accounts.
Little by little, through labor and acts of mutual tending, the ridge of suspicion leveled. Jonah's brand remained pale on his forearm like a remnant of bad weather. Sometimes men would glance and remember the old rumors. But when they did, the memory that came with it had shifted. It was no longer only a scar of danger, but also the same mark on a man who had washed an unfamiliar woman's feet and who had stood in court for another. In small domestic moments, a loaf split and shared, wood chopped, a net mended and loaned, he found a different measure of himself. He allowed himself to be seen without the need to perform the grim role others had carved. Anna continued to stitch a life out of thread and grit. She did not become sentimental about the ledger or about Sarah's inheritance. She honored what was lost by making small, fierce decisions, to plant rows, to keep books in order, to say no when Harrow's men attempted another small slight. She refused to be small. That refusal, coupled with Jonah's quiet steadiness, created the core of what they would call, in later years, a household. The winter that came felt long and honest. They banked the fires with the lessons Jonah had taught. Snow lay like a clean sheet on the yard, and the world narrowed its colors to white and brown and a few determined greens. They braided hair in the low light of the stove. They invited Mrs. Gable over sometimes, and she brought news of the town that had once frightened Anna. Sometimes Harrow's name still surfaced, but more often he was merely a subject of gossip and scorn that had lost its edge. The little ledger that had cost $3 sat in a carved box under Anna's pillow, no longer a legal talisman, but a memory of all that had been passed between them. One evening in late spring, they hosted a small harvest meal in celebration of the planting. The table was crude and their plates even more so, but the bread was warm and the stew thoughtful. They had put a new post on the ridge with Sarah's name and a little hand-carved H that was Jonah's, not Harrow's, a reclamation of the symbol, a subtle joke between them that stitched up a cut. They spoke of small things. The boy Caleb had taken to teaching chores, Abernathy's new ledger book with neat new pages, a neighbor's house that had needed repairs. The world moved on in quiet, ordinary ways. At night, when the house creaked and snow melted into damp spotlights under the eaves, Jonah and Anna would sit and braid each other's hair, no grand declarations needed. They worked in a language of fingers. Sometimes they spoke of the things that haunted them still, the fire that had taken the cabin, the miscarriage that had hollowed a place in their lives. They did not promise to erase those shapes, they promised to carry them together. "Do you ever regret staying?" Jonah asked one lunar night.
a question that was both simple and enormous. Anna held a lock of hair and let it twist between her fingers.
I might regret other things, she said, but I don't regret choosing you. I don't regret the ledger. I don't regret the way I stood in court. Those were not mistakes. They were the cost of keeping something true. Jonah's hand covered hers, and for a moment the bruise of the past seemed less like a wound and more like a map. Years do not heal all things, but they accustom. The town eventually ceased to see Jonah as the scapegoat he had been made out to be. Harrow's control dissipated into a dozen small rebellions, men leaving, contracts breaking, the simple economy of a town reasserting itself. Harrow, reduced but not destroyed, became a warning more than an authority. He tended his own affairs with less swagger and more solitude. Anna would sometimes go to town to fetch thread or to deliver a bundle of shirts. People greeted her with a kind of rough respect. A few asked for her advice about claims and ledgers, and she answered them in the plain way she always had, but with a steadier voice. Once, a young woman cried in her lap about a similar threat from a man who sought to appropriate her claim with forged paper. Anna listened and then wrote a firm note for the woman to take to Judge Vance, explaining the clerk's procedures and naming where to find Abernathy's witness. The lesson had become part of her. She would not allow another woman to be frightened by the same paper ghosts. Jonah continued to mend nets and make snares, to teach boys how to read a river and how a hand should hold an axe. He taught those things with a patience that had a small righteous tenderness to it. He braided hair when asked, sometimes with a wry comment, but mostly simply as an offered kindness. People came to him with small reparations. He accepted them without fanfare. Their life never again felt the raw urgency of the early days, those days of letters and 3 silver coins in courtrooms, but it had a quiet dignity. They rebuilt not to erase the past, but to live with it, to let the scars be part of the story they would tell at a hearth when neighbors came to visit. There were nights, of course, when Anna would turn in the dark and wake to find the bed empty when Jonah took walks to the ridge to think. He would always come back, with a small gift, a rabbit snares catch, a carved button, a new piece of braided leather. Those were the stitches that kept a life together. In time, their old scarred house became a hub of small human transactions, a neighbor's dinner sharing, a child's terrified sobs soothed by both of them, a place where people left cookies on the porch and were sometimes called inside to warm. The memory of the $3 never disappeared. It was a piece of the myth they both carried. Sometimes, when a talk at the general store turned toward past injustices, someone would mention in an odd way how Anna had paid $3 for Jonah. The story no longer read like purchase, but like 2 people who chose each other under odd, hard conditions. On a clear morning, many years later, Anna and Jonah stood at the edge of their field, the sun like a coin lifted high. Anna's hair had streaks of silver, but was still braided in the same careful manner. Jonah's brand remained faint, like a pale memory. They worked the land with hands that had known fight and tenderness. Children, the neighbors, and now sometimes their own, 2 boys who had been orphaned near town, ran about and called Jonah by a name that meant something more than a rumor. He responded with a laugh that no longer had an edge. They had learned how to tend the small economy of the household, how to put away a ledger, how to bank the fire, how to wash feet when the world demanded an answer in humble gestures. They had learned, more important than any law, that dignity is often made in service rather than in ownership. The town's small shifts had proven true. Belonging was not deeded by ink alone, but by the daily acts of care and witness. At dusk, they would sit on the porch and braid each other's hair until the light was thin and the evening breathed its coolness over the valley. Sometimes they would wash the grit from each other's feet at the end of a long day. No ceremony, but a ritual that held all the days in it. The river, the courtroom, the burned cabin, the cave, the kneeling, and the silence that had once stabilized them. They never forgot the past. They kept a small cabinet with the ledger and the 3 coins in a drawer as a reminder.
not of purchase, but of the curve their lives had taken when they had refused to be swallowed by rumor. In the end, Harrow's brand on the world was reduced to a cautionary tale told in the shade of the general store. How a man's appetite for power can be checked by small acts of courage and by the patient work of a clerk who reads ink honestly. Harrow moved on, as all men do. The land remained. Anna and Jonah's life was not the kind of tidy ending sold in songs. It was a careful series of days stitched by hands that had known both ash and reckoning. On one fine morning when the apples had just started to feather, Anna looked at Jonah and untied the braid at the back of his neck. She took his hands in her own, and for a spell neither spoke. The world around them hummed with bees and distant voices. The long ledger of their years lay folded in a drawer near the hearth. They had paid a price and received one. They had loved and labored. Their life was a ledger of small, steady debts paid by kindness. Jonah reached down, as he had once done in the dim days after the courthouse, and washed her feet in silence. The basin was warm, the cloth soft. It was not a surrender nor a purchase. It was a vow made without words, to continue choosing one another in the ordinary, service-laden days that make up a life. Anna closed her eyes as his hands moved with careful, practiced tenderness. When he finished, they sat for a long time in the hush, the house breathing around them.
Neither of them needed to say what the other knew, that scars remain, that winters will return, and that the past is never wholly undone. Yet they had each other, and the quiet community that had learned slowly to honor acts of service more than the loud claim of a brand or the swagger of a hat. The $3 had been a beginning, not an ending. It had led to a man being found more human than rumor had allowed, and to a woman who would not be reduced to the stories others told of her. If this tale moved you, if the quiet courage of doing small, hard things in the face of power struck you, then carry it forward. Tell the story of those who wash and braid and bank coals, of the clerk who reads ink and the woman who signs not to buy but to choose. Share it with someone who needs to hear that a life is built of hands, of small acts, and of the persistent choice to stay. If you'd like more stories where the land is both kind and cruel, and where people stitch themselves back together through service and work, follow along.